Oh, yeah, that's exactly the one.
Excellent.
Yeah, thought I recognised it.
Well, somebody always joins just afterwards.
Yeah, that's the way that works.
Oh, I'm just lurking.
Right, then, shall we get going? We're recording, so that's good.
Yeah.
Right, well, thank you very much, Paul, for offering to chat to us about OneDrive. It's got a lot of interest, actually. It's quite, so we're now at 240 members in our meeting group now. That's up from 101, I think it was, the start of lockdown. So that's quite impressive. So yeah, Paul is going to take us through deploying OneDrive in the enterprise. You've been doing quite a big rollout, I believe, over the last.
Yes. Can you see my screen? Okay.
You sure can.
Slides. Okay. Cool. Okay. So deploying OneDrive in the enterprise. So I think I probably know most of you, but for those of you that I don't know, I'm Paul Gallagher. I outside of IT, photography is kind of a passion of mine, particularly street photography or social documentary photography. I'm also a massive Barnsley fan. I'm part of the Supporters Trust at Barnsley, so if someone can keep me up to date with the score tonight, that would be great. Thank you. Also dad to Sophie, who kind of takes up quite a lot of my time as well. So I haven't managed to get her interested in football yet, but I'm trying my best. So does everyone, I mean, one thing that occurred to me just before this meeting is that I haven't actually got a slide that talks about what OneDrive is and why it's important in Microsoft 365. I assume people kind of already know that, or is it worth kind of just touching on that to start with?
I think we're good.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. In which case, so I'm going to break this down into sort of 5 rough kind of sections. So planning, the kind of deployment of OneDrive. I'm kind of going to concentrate more on your traditional sync app to the OneDrive sync client to the kind of Windows and Mac devices, etc. I think the kind of mobile story is probably a session in itself with the kind of DLP and the various other kind of ways of deploying and managing the kind of OneDrive mobile apps. So I'm not going to going to go into that in too much detail in this session. We're going to talk about the migration of local data, so the stuff that's sitting on maybe a user's hard disk rather than on a network share, or maybe on a network share as well, and a kind of self-driven migrations, and then deploying and configuring the sync app, whether that's on Mac OS, on Windows 7, Windows 10, and some of the challenges around different flavors of clients you might find in a typical sort of large enterprise. And we'll also briefly touch on migration from cloud-based migration into OneDrive, and also kind of migrating file share data, or at least some of the options around that. I'm going to assume that kind of we're not going to get into sort of group-based licensing, or at this point, I'm kind of assuming that OneDrive is licensed along with other Office 365 products. But if anyone's got any questions around that, we can talk about it. So first part of the planning is understanding kind of what the end user computing ecosystem looks like in your particular organization. So in a large enterprise, there's probably lots of different flavors of client. So have you got any Windows 7 machines left? Certainly, the last few places where I've kind of clients I've had, they're still trying to move to Windows 10. You get the typical apps that have got dependencies that need to be migrated to Windows. Even going from Windows 7 to Windows 10, there are issues around that. So the question is, should you be, if you've got a bunch of Windows 7 users, should you be targeting them for, OneDrive sync client rollout, for example? Because it does have its, own issues. Windows 7 have files on demand, so everything you've got in your OneDrive essentially, will kind of get synced down. You don't get the the files on demand where you can say, right, I want these files but not these files, or you can keep most of the files in the cloud and then sync them down as required. So that's kind of got its own considerations. How do you manage your software on your clients in the organization? Do they do it via group policy, via SCCM? Is it kind of more modern with kind of Windows 10 Intune enrolled devices? And all these kind of things will have a bearing on how you control and how you roll out OneDrive into the organization. So what does a kind of well thought out business implementation plan include? And we're not going to touch on all of these different things because it's just, for a 1 hour session, I guess, we won't cover them, but we just kind of briefly talk about a few of them. So obviously provisioning, by default, a user's OneDrive for business site is created the first time they visit it. Once they've been given a license, which you could do via a dynamic licensing and group-based licensing. Once they visit that OneDrive, it will then kind of get created. But it may be that if you're rolling out to 100,000 users, you probably don't want to have the delay. If you're doing a kind of big bang approach and switching all on for everyone, you might want to go ahead and run a script to provision the OneDrives ahead of time, for example. Or it might be there are certain folders you need to deploy into their OneDrive, and you might want to have a kind of scripted approach to setting up the kind of OneDrive. So the provisioning is one side of it, and typically the existing content on their local hard drive probably also needs to be redirected if they want to provide like a seamless experience to them. So if they've got a Windows 10 machine and you're now switching on OneDrive and they've been putting stuff in their My Documents folder, which probably in a large enterprise might be unlikely. It might be more likely that they've got like an H drive or a map network drive where they put that. But in some cases that's the case. We need to think about how we migrate. We give them the OneDrive and how we would migrate the content that's already on their machines, or if they're kind of laptop users, etc. Obviously, one of the most powerful features of OneDrive for Business is the ability to synchronize your files across multiple devices and have them available for offline use. And obviously, this requires a sync client. So that's the deployment of that is should be planned. Obviously, it's pre-installed with Windows 10. But if you are going to deploy it by Windows 7, you need to think about how you're going to get it onto the devices. And then kind of admin controls and governance. By default, OneDrive allows users to share with anyone and access the files from any device from any location. If you're in a regulated business, or that might not be that might be the kind of right balance between freedom and control to safeguard company data. So while we are also preventing users from choosing to store or share their files somewhere outside the organization. We are kind of trying to avoid shadow IT, but we need to put some controls around it, and some of those admin controls and governance that we can look at. So conditional access, for example, might be one particular control. Deciding should users be able to download or print and synchronize files on any device from any location, or should they be able to do that on the competitor's office, for example. So you could put conditional access controls around to stop those kind of things occurring. And do you want your users in your enterprise to sync with a consumer OneDrive, for example? So again, this is probably something that we'd probably want to lock down as far as the controls that are available for us, as well as the mobile app. How we control that. Can they use their personal mobiles to do that? If they do that, do we allow them to download files and share them with WhatsApp or something? Again, that's something that we would lock down via MDM and MAM policies in Intune or Mobile Iron or some kind of MDM mobile solution. So one of the other things we need to think about is that with any of the kind of move to the cloud is planning the network utilization, particularly for OneDrive. You've got a whole bunch of machines that people have got, and they're syncing data to the cloud. Where are your internet egress points? Have you got enough? Have you got enough bandwidth? Where are your users located, and are they can they get is their egress point near to where their devices are located? For example, if they're on a corporate network, does it mean they're going across a WAN to then connect to the internet in some other country? And that does happen. And you kind of need to work with your network team to ensure the kind of shortest path to the internet from wherever those devices are located on the corporate network, if they're on the corporate network, of course. One of the things you need to do is assess the number of users and computers. Using computers per user which you're going to deploy the sync app. So if each installation is going to multiply the amount of bandwidth you use. So if you've got lots of users who've got 2 and 3 machines syncing, that's 3 times the bandwidth for every user that you've got with a computer. And so you kind of need to understand these kind of numbers and measure the network utilization of the sync app for a pilot group. And that's kind of Microsoft's recommendation is to control the sync, but also to start off with small groups in representative locations. Of if it's a global a global company, then set up set up pilots in representative areas, and then you can use things like speed test tools like Wireshark or Fiddler and understand the throughput of the users. If you're kind of got a global proxies that are kind of globally load balanced, for example, then you can usually get your networks team to monitor the amount of traffic that OneDrive is generating on the various proxies, and as you ramp up your rollout of OneDrive, you can then monitor this kind of what is the impact of the initial load of getting the user's data and maybe doing a known folder move to push their data initially into the cloud, versus once they're using it, what's the kind of BAU sync traffic that you get, and then you kind of extrapolate to the to the whole user base that you're trying to migrate onto the service. So Microsoft don't really have any magical calculators where you can just plug in, right, I've got 100,000 OneDrive users, give me an answer to how much bandwidth I use, how many proxies, and all that kind of stuff. It really is a case of kind of measuring the network utilization for a pilot group, estimating the number of files and the typical file sizes and all those things, which is quite it's quite time consuming when you've got large numbers of users. But you can use those measurements from the pilot group to extrapolate to the entire organization, and then retest and validate. As you're ramping up, you can kind of retest and validate your estimations, and you're going to find that each organization is different, so it kind of depends on how they're using the tool, how much sync are they doing on SharePoint document libraries, etc. Some organizations, that's the only way they access SharePoint is they sync a document library once they've got it, or they've already got map drives to SharePoint on-prem. And they just want to work in the same way, and kind of getting them to change their way of working is sometimes interesting. You can also control the sync throughput. So you can set up network quality of service policies, and I'll show you how to do that. And they can provide sort of better control of a sync app traffic on the network. But if you can't use these, there's also some network throughput policies. Which are provided by the sync app, and let you or users choose the amount of the throughput settings, and probably the recommended thing is to enforce these by a GPO or Intune policy, etc. to enforce those on the users, and you can work with the networks team to tune that as you roll out more and more users. One of the other issues that I've seen and I've heard about in lots of places is when you have, I think Microsoft's recommendation is not to use kind of proxy infrastructure to offer access OneDrive or any Office 365 services, but many large organizations they have like Blue Coat proxies or a whole bunch of other proxy technologies and more and more cloud proxies now. And one of the, as you kind of add more and more Office 365 services to a large organization, there are times where just the sheer number of connections from, Outlook, from OneDrive, from, SharePoint and all Teams and all the other, all the services, actually, it's not the bandwidth that kills the proxy infrastructure, it's the number of connections. And I've heard stories where, organizations are rebooting their proxies, several times a day across the globe, just because they haven't thought about, scaling out the proxy infrastructure as they've tried to move to the cloud. So, that's another thing to kind of bear in mind, is not just for OneDrive, but for any of the, sort of Office 365 services as your organization moves to the cloud. We've done some planning, and we want to install OneDrive on all our machines, Windows 10, Mac, etc. So how do we get them there? Obviously, the OneDrive sync client is automatically installed on Windows 10, and once it's enabled, it will update to the latest version depending on which of the rings that you are on. We'll talk about the different rings later. You can also deploy OneDrive with Office Pro Plus. So if you're pushing Office Pro Plus and you want to get Windows 7 machines up and running, for example, that can be configured with an Office Pro Plus installation. It will put OneDrive on Windows 7. It won't keep it up to date though. So the next time you deploy an update of Office Pro Plus, the OneDrive sync client isn't included in that. OneDrive has its own release cadence, and it's self-managing once you've got it onto the machine, or it can be self-managing. That can then it will then update independently of the Office deployment that it's been installed with in the first place. And then you've got you can deploy it with Intune or with Autopilot. So the idea where you just send a user a blank, just a standard off-the-shelf desktop, and then all they do is they'll authenticate with their Office credentials, and it'll start building out their environment and setting up with their OneDrive. And that's another way of deploying OneDrive along with the other kind of Office and products via Autopilot. So just kind of a brief mention on virtual desktops. So I don't, many kind of large organizations, they use virtual desktop technologies, and instead of having individual on-premises hardware workstations running their desktops, they often use virtual desktop infrastructure, and they offer end users the same sort of environment but without the kind of same hardware framework. So and then within the virtual desktop infrastructure, there's kind of two real sort of choices: persistent and non-persistent VDIs, and each one's got its own benefits and disadvantages in the corporate IT context. But from a OneDrive point of view, persistent VDI or stateful VDI is where each user's got an individual desktop is kind of uniquely customized. So just kind of like it's a virtual desktop, but it's got essentially the same. It's got the same. It works in the same way as your laptop, etc. But then you've got the non-persistent VDIs, which on the other hand, it doesn't save anything, any file settings or anything, and it usually runs on top of, say, Windows, one flavor of Windows Server. So, and it's kind of made to look like Windows 7 or Windows 10, and it just kind of creates this generic desktop that always kind of reverts to the same setup every time a user logs out. The problem with that with OneDrive though is, if you log in and it starts syncing your files from there and you make some changes, then you log out again, everything gets lost at that point. Nothing's saved. So the way to make that work on non-persistent VDIs is to use something called FS Logic that Microsoft bought. I think it was like last year or the year before, which is essentially you have file storage, and you have some VHDs, some virtual disks. And basically, as a user logs on it mounts a small virtual disk, and that's used for things like your Outlook OST cache, and for your OneDrive, your OneDrive settings, etc. And also Office Pro Plus can use it as well. And essentially, all the stuff that needs to be saved is saved on that small virtual disk. So when someone logs out, that's persisted. So the next time they log in, that OneDrive cache is kind of in the same place. So that's one thing to bear in mind if you're doing non-persistent VDIs. So the OneDrive Admin Center, there are some bunch of configurations that we should look at doing. So we can look at configuring how sharing, what types of sharing links we have. If we want to block any specific file types, if we want to have any storage limits or quotas. I mean, going back to the the VDIs, for example, if you've only got a limited amount of space, you might not want to give someone terabytes of data in the cloud that they could then keep trying to sync onto their virtual desktop, especially if it's one that kind of the disks auto expand, because then they're pulling down all their data, and actually rather than saving space on prem, they can start eating into it quite easily. So that might be something you want to look at limiting. Device access, we can in the admin center do some rudimentary mobile application management, but probably the right place is to go into Intune and do if you've got that licensed, and you've got kind of much richer control in that place. Compliance wise, if you need to set retention labels, retention policies, again in OneDrive, that's another option that we might want to look at. So if you might want to have a 3-year retention on all your data in OneDrive, for example. We can also control, the email notifications that go out of OneDrive. So when someone shares a link, etc., we might not want to send out these annoying emails every time, and we can go in and control that. And then there's also a link to some of the data migration tools. If I just kind of fire over to if I can find it, my desktop. So just looking at. Just looking in the OneDrive admin center. Oh, try again. So yeah, links wise, we can go in and we can determine the kinds of links that are selected by default. And in the particular organization I'm working with now, we default that to only people inside the organization, because actually we can't share with people outside the organization. And in a similar way, we would lock down this OneDrive and SharePoint to sharing with no external sharing, only people within the organization, as well as additional conditional access policies to enforce that as well. We could have additional settings if we wanted to for external sharing, and we'll go in and configure these here. Those sync settings that I mentioned, talking about, we can. This one's very useful. Is allowing syncing only PCs joined to specific domains. So what we kind of do is, if you've got a laptop or or a machine, we would basically provide the domain GUID in here. So the only or the tenant GUID I can't remember which one it is now, but the essentially means that you can only sync to this tenant. You can't sync with other tenants. So this is a this kind of locks it down to here. Then there's also this block sync on macOS, because I think that control wasn't initially available on macOS, but I believe you can do that. You can do that now. And you can also block syncing of specific file types, which kind of would be useful, but the problem is users can just open the OneDrive web interface and just upload them there. So it's kind of although it works in the sync client, it doesn't block anything in the OneDrive web interface, which is a bit annoying, because we've got a requirement where certain types of files, for e-discovery reasons, we don't want to put into OneDrive for regulatory reasons, and we can't use this functionality to lock that down, unfortunately. Well, we can use this, but we can't then stop people just uploading it via the web browser, which is a bit annoying. Storage wise, this is where we break that down. We can set the defaults in there. Device access, I think in an ideal world, I think you should do that via mobile application management Intune now. It's all grayed out. I don't know if that's because that is now that you can't actually do that anymore. But generally we do that inside Intune. And then things that are links here to retention policies in the security and compliance center. Again, doing e-discovery searches in the security and compliance center, and these are just links off to everywhere else. This whole OneDrive admin center is actually going to be rolled into the SharePoint admin center, and I think that was announced at Ignite, and I think that'll be coming along fairly soon. Any questions so far?
Are you guys using ExpressRoute
Yes, we are using ExpressRoute. Mainly at the moment for migration of Exchange Online and OneDrive. So rather than pushing stuff across the proxies, we've got ExpressRoutes in kind of 3 of the different regions in the world, and
so you're sort of using Microsoft peerings and things like that.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Ah, okay,
but we are moving to using that in a production sense as well. So peering, Teams traffic, etc. will start going over ExpressRoute next year.
Yeah.
So yeah, the plan is to use that more extensively.
Does that work quite well?
Yes. So yeah, I mean, it's apparently so.
Yeah, the reason I was asking because there's sort of one of the Leeds Hospital sort of were chatting about it. They've switched it off. Well, they didn't enable it, and I was sort of wondering if you might have used it, so I could advise them that it's worked well for them. Yeah, they're a bit worried about all the traffic going over.
Microsoft are pushing to use that as opposed, because they don't really recommend going across the. They've got proxy infrastructure. They're doing packet inspection on some traffic. That's none of that stuff really recommended for any of this cloud traffic. So the direct route via ExpressRoute is going to be much better than what we've currently got where I am now. So yeah, I mean, it depends what the alternative is, I guess. But certainly for what's been used in the bank, then yeah, it's the way to go, I think.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Okay, so
Dan's sorry, Paul.
Yeah,
Dan's got a question.
Question I have is, I remember in a certain supermarket I was working in, and they had the option to the build, so the Windows 10 build, to add the local Windows folders to OneDrive, and they were really nervous about the retention policy coming in and just removing files wholesale. And I can't remember the name of the setting. It's a setting in
known folder move.
That's the one.
Yeah, I'll come on to that. Actually, I've got some slides on that. We'll talk about that. I mean, I'm not too. I'm probably in the same place as them, to be honest, about that particular setting.
Okay. Thanks.
In fact, we'll talk about it in just a second. So Microsoft have got a like an ideal state that they recommend now that you kind of minimum that you configure if you're deploying the OneDrive Sync app. First one of these things is called the Windows Notification Service. So this uses Windows Push Notification Service to sync files in real time. So when a change happens, you make a change, say for example in a file in your OneDrive via the Office web apps, then that essentially a push notification will be sent to that you'll be subscribed to will kind of eliminates any redundant polling and saving any unnecessarily computing power. So it's pushing from the cloud back into the organization essentially. And this isn't just for Windows, by the way. This also is implemented on the Mac Sync client. So this is for Mac and Windows. So a change occurs in Microsoft 365. WNS alerts the sync app of the change, and then OneDrive adds it to the internal server change queue, and then any changes happened immediately rather than waiting the next time it tries to do a sync 10 every minute or something. So this just kind of makes things a lot snappier from a sync point of view. And then we've got files on demand, which I recommend you kind of save. You switch on. I don't know if you can see this properly. Essentially, a blue cloud icon next to OneDrive file or folder indicates that the file's only available online. And then when you click it, essentially, so it doesn't take up any space on your computer. It's just essentially a pointer to the file in the cloud. And then you click on it, and then it just the file system in the background, it downloads it without any issue to the application that's perhaps using it. That's available again on Windows and Mac, but that's files on demand is something that they recommend. Another thing is the kind of to use the update rings. So there's a couple of URLs that you need to whitelist on your proxies or your internet gateways so that OneDrive can automatically download the latest updates. There are three rings, as Microsoft call them. there's the insiders ring. So this is, all the latest, preview code that's already kind of been through a test cycle within Microsoft, but then gets pushed out. And this allows you to kind of look at what's coming down the road as far as the sync client goes. So, if there's some new features you need to check out before they hit your end users, then, you can do that in this insider ring, and your ops team should probably, do that as each each changes come along, as particular ones that are, kind of larger changes, and you can monitor that. Then you've got the production ring, and that kind of, there's a new update to that, every 2 to 4 weeks. This is the one that Microsoft recommend everyone is on. And as I say, this is every 2 to 4 weeks. And then you've got the deferred ring, or it was known until very recently as the enterprise ring. This is the one we use. Because having that degree of change in a banking environment, it makes people very nervous. So what that means is that every 2 to 3 months there's a new version comes along, and there's a 60-day window, and you can actually you can use like SCCM or other ways of deploying that update, so you can tell the sync client to go and update. And you've got a 60-day window, and if you've not done it in that 60-day window, it will just automatically update. But it gives you a bit more control, and it also allows you to say you might say have 1,000 users that you roll it out to first, just to make sure there's no issues, and then you might roll it out to a slightly larger group, and you can control via SCCM those group of users, and generally we've got the engineering people generally in the insiders ring. You've got some people who get the production ring, product owners and things like that, and then you've got the deferred ring is for the majority of the organization, although that will be tested, and there'll be a smaller user base it will be tested against to start with. For example, the end user computing user base might get that first. Silent account config, pretty straightforward really. This is just when you first give someone a OneDrive, rather than having to type their username and password in, this just allows them to OneDrive to start up and automatically log them in and get started with it, essentially, which wasn't the case initially with OneDrive when it first arrived. So known folder move, which is what Daniel was talking about. So this is you might have seen it. You get this prompt on the screen where it says your IT department wants you to protect your important folders. The only problem with it is, there's 2 things. You can do this silently, so you don't even have to tell them that you're doing this. It could just happen, and I don't know how you communicate that to users that actually you've scooped up a load of their data and you've moved it into the cloud and you've repointed their desktop folder, their pictures folder and their documents folder, but yet you haven't bothered doing their favorites and other folders that potentially it doesn't capture everything, and there isn't really the control to know when things have gone wrong either. So we deem this as being too risky to do. To use this at all. Microsoft recommend it, but we couldn't. When we tested it, there was just too many things too many problems that this core would cause from a support point of view, because essentially it will just pick up those folders and migrate them to the cloud. Now, what in the current organization I'm working with, they've got some folder redirection already in place. So these folders actually point to a local H drive. So they're already redirected to the desktop, and pictures and documents are actually sitting on a file share essentially anyway. And what that means is there are other things on that file share that also need to be migrated, which further complicates, this is a kind of self-moving scenario. So we discounted this, and in a similar way to the supermarket that Daniel mentioned, we didn't go down this route. Now, storage sense is very useful. The next thing, which essentially this lets you automatically on Windows 10 clean up a locally available file. So you can switch this on, and you can essentially free up space. But not only that, you can actually, if I just flick over to my, gone the wrong way again, to move this around. If I just pull up storage sense in here, storage settings. So if I just go in at storage, if I just configure storage sense now, so it can run. Let me just zoom in. It can run on low disk space, and it can get rid of temporary files. Great, or delete files in my downloads folder. But the interesting thing is OneDrive. You can essentially say, if I haven't used a file in 1 day or 14 days or 30 days or 60 days, and we can choose that, and we can configure that as for an organization. So what we say is, if you've not used a file in 14 days, we're going to rehydrate it to the cloud. So it will disappear off your local laptop or your VDI to save space. And if you've not used it in 14 days or in 30 days, it will it'll rehydrate it, and the next time you use it, it will download again. And the other thing it'll do is it'll do a similar task if you are running out of space on your laptop, for example. So if you sync loads and loads of stuff and actually you start filling up your your Surface Book or something, then storage sense can kick in and start dehydrating OneDrive files just to free up some space, as well as recycle bins and all those kind of things. So it's kind of, that's pretty useful. That's kind of been in Windows 10 for a little while now. And there are the policies available to implement that as well now. Office integration, kind of leave that on. There's a couple of network. There's a couple of things you should configure to allow network traffic to bypass ws.windows.com, and also avoid HTTPS decryption on this as well, because that can cause problems. And often, security, and particularly in large secure organizations, often would like to do HTTPS decryption on the proxies. But there's certain things that you kind of need to leave out of that. So the Office integration, what that's doing is that's the kind of differential sync that the Office apps use. So it makes sense to keep that switched on. Files on demand we've already talked about. I've got the Office sync things again. I think I've duplicated a slide here, and the silent account configuration. So we've got these settings, and there are a whole bunch of other ones that you can do. How do you deploy them? So Active Directory, GPOs, it's kind of like the old school, and probably the most common way in large organizations of controlling applications and computer settings is to use a group policy, and deploy that, and use security groups to control which computers and which users get which policies. Endpoint Configuration Manager, or System Center Configuration Manager, as it's probably more commonly known. I think it's only just changed very recently, the naming, and that's again often used to send software to machines. We can use it to deploy OneDrive, Office Pro Plus, and also configure the updates, or via Intune for Intune enrolled Windows devices. So if they're AAD joined, if they're joined to AAD rather than AD, then you can control these things with all these policies within Intune, essentially. We'll see that in a second. I just flick back to my keeps doing that. Just flick back to my desktop and just look at the group policy editor. So I've got a group policy editor set up here. I've already imported the ADMX files and the ADML files into the local policy store here. They live. If you want the latest file, you'll find them in the OneDrive deployment folder. So I think if you go to the app, what is it? App data, local data. I can't remember, but essentially you can find them in your local OneDrive files. You'll find the ADML and AX file. And once you've imported those, you can see the different OneDrive policies. Now, you've got two flavors of policy. You've got computer policies and you've got user configuration policies. So this one you apply to the the machines, and you can set up security groups to do that and drop machines into them to apply this configuration. Some of the ones that we've talked about, so allow syncing OneDrive accounts for only specific organizations. So we can add in here this if we add our organization into here, it means we can only sync with our own organization, not other organizations, so that to reduce any data loss risk, essentially. Configure team site libraries to sync automatically. So if we wanted to have particular SharePoint team sites synced automatically, we can get the ID in when we click on the sync button on the SharePoint document library. We can actually copy the ID in there, and then if we enable it, we can add the GUIDs that are provided into. We can give it a name, and we can paste the GUID into here, and it will automatically sync those document libraries, and we can enforce that by a GPO. So I guess in this is something that it might make more sense to. You can do this via a script as well, actually, and that might make more sense in some circumstances if you have, different scripts that run for different parts of the organization when they log in, for example. But if you want to do it by group policy and have different group policies for different parts of the organization, you could do it this way. We can limit this sync app upload rate. We can prevent users from syncing libraries and folders from other organizations. We can prevent users from moving their Windows and own folders to OneDrive, which is what we talked about there. So if we don't want them to do that, then we could enforce that. We could say, no, we don't want them to do this migration. We'll do that for them. So we'll switch that feature off, and in their sync app, they won't be able to manually do it. We can block specific organizations. I can't think of a good reason why you would just say, right, I don't want to sync with this organization. But that is possible. I've not come across anyone needing to do that. Set the maximum number of users OneDrive that can download automatically. This is a setting that's used with the silently sync OneDrive, and I think it's more useful for Windows 7 where you don't have files on demand, because if you've got like a massive OneDrive and you've only got a small hard disk, you do get the option to select which folders you want to download, and I think this is kind of determining when that should happen. Bandwidth management we talked about, excluding specific kinds of files from being uploaded. Always kind of enable OneDrive files on demand. The update ring we set here as well in the group policy. What other things are there? Instead of going through everything. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of there's some stuff around here to do with SharePoint. We can also sync to SharePoint 2019, and there are some settings around there. And then we've got some of the the user ones, which are things like configure team site libraries to sync automatically again, or disabling the tutorial. And whether if there's a battery saver mode turned on, should we switch the syncing off, for example, and co-authoring. So we've got a whole bunch of things here. We configure these GPOs and generally have some security groups, and we deploy them to the various sysvol servers, sysvol shares, etc. And that's kind of one way of configuring all the different settings for OneDrive, and those, particularly those settings that Microsoft are kind of recommending in that sense. So what about Mac OS? We can also do many of these settings on Mac OS, and I think organizations that I've seen that have Mac devices, certainly managed Mac devices, I think nearly always use a product called Jamf or use Jamf with Intune. I haven't come across any other ones. I'm sure there probably are, but I think they all work in the same way. There is this preference file settings that you can get to on your Mac, and it's very similar to kind of GPO. You have sort of key value pairs for each of these things, and you can you can set some of these. So some of them are very similar. They allow tenant list, blocking external sync, files on demands are enabled, open at login. So they're all very very similar. I think that there's less control on the Mac for sure, but it is there. There is also the Microsoft have recently introduced a shared single sign-on experience for Office for Mac and OneDrive, which just means that if you sign into one of them and you open one of the other ones, you don't have to sign in again. But you do have to. It's not like the single sign-in that use use AD in kind of if you've got a machine that's joined to Active Directory or AAD, you do have to authenticate at some point with one of the products. It just stops you having to do it multiple times. We talked about that. So configuring OneDrive settings in Intune. You can also go into Intune, the device configuration profiles, and you've got very similar levels of control in Intune, and you can also deploy stuff with PowerShell, etc. in Intune as well. So there we've got silently signing users OneDrive to the OneDrive sync client. All the same kind of settings, just a different interface and a different for those AAD joined machines that you might have for Windows 10, etc. And then we're kind of thinking about migration wise, if unless your organization is sort of brand new, then it's likely you've got files stored in different places, whether that be on-prem in file shares, services like Dropbox or Box or Google Drive, or in some cases it will be on their their local laptops, and maybe there isn't the kind of current backups in place, and that known folder move might well be a good option in that case. So I guess you've got the IT driven or user driven migration for OneDrive. What content should be migrated, and there are some things that you won't be able to migrate, or you'll have problems migrating. So for example, if you've got any applications that are using things like Access on the local drive, or OneNote, for example, until very recently the migration process of that was a bit more tricky. So that there probably needs to be some discovery done up front before you start migrating users. Particularly if it's a large organization with lots of data, you're going to find the various issues, and the whole migration story I guess could be a session in its own. But just kind of talking about some of the tools that are available. We talked about the known folder move, and if you do want to go down that route because you've got users who've got laptops and have got local data on their machines, and you just want to do a simple move of that data, you've got the OneDrive known folder move GPO that we talked about. You add the ADM file to the central store, you configure the GPO settings there. This is doing it at a domain level. I was just looking at it on the local computer just to show the different GPOs, but you can specify which which users or computers you want to apply that to, so you can do what's called security filtering. So you can you can have specific groups of users that you can apply the GPO to so you want to do it you wouldn't want to do this in a big bang approach, because that could overload your network. You'd want to do it in a very controlled approach of slowly ramping it up and doing a number of users at a time, and kind of evaluating it as you go on, and kind of making adjustments as you do that, and doing it in waves essentially. But that's kind of self migration, or even silent migration of that data you could do via a GPO. There's also the option to do kind of user-driven migration using the SharePoint migration tool, and we have used this, and it is quite useful. So you've got a couple of options really. You can kind of make this available to the users to download somewhere on your network or deploy it to their machine, and just provide them with a set of instructions. And it's quite easy to use, and they can just add the locations they want to migrate into their OneDrive, and with a bit of guidance, if they're a little bit tech savvy, then this can be an option to migrate that. I think one of the downsides of it though is again, how do you control when they do it? You don't want thousands of people doing it during the day in business hours, so you do kind of need to almost deploy it in waves or give it to them in waves, to do that. There is also the option to do a kind of scripted approach for this, where you know where all the data is, and you pick that up and you build a migration job with this tool, with the PowerShell commandlets of this tool, and you deploy those and run it. The only slight downside to that is, and you could have done it. If you use a service account somehow and you encrypt the password, then you could deploy it overnight, and you could have an overnight process to do that. Otherwise, you need to get the users to kind of authenticate as part of the process. That's kind of one of the things that's lacking at the moment with the with how the migration tool works in that sense. So it's possible to build control into that, but there's a bit of extra work and scripting and service accounts and various things. And then you've got Mover, which Microsoft bought. I don't know, was that a year, 18 months ago now? Mover's got, if you're moving stuff from, other cloud locations like Box or Dropbox or G Suite, then you can do all this stuff essentially in the browser. You can provide CSV files of mappings from a particular cloud account to the OneDrive. You can set that going in blocks of users, and then there is full auditing where you can see every single file, etc., and everything that's been migrated for each user. And it also works quite nicely with on-prem file shares as well, and then allows you to set that up. It perhaps hasn't got the same kind of level of granularity and being able to hook into the creation of OneDrive, something like a Quest or an AvePoint or a ShareGate tool might have for doing these kind of migrations, but it's probably a damn sight faster than ShareGate for migrating content off file shares into OneDrive, and you can kind of create multiple sort of versions of it running, and it can shift data fairly quickly if you've got the network capacity. And then there's the fast track option. So if you've got more than 500 licenses, then you can get fast track to actually perform your help you with the migration essentially. I mean, they do provide a service to kind of give you a set of best practices and tools and resources and experts committed to making to try and make the experience of moving to the cloud an easier one, I suppose. I think what we found with Fast Track was that they're very regimented in how they do that migration, and the kinds of things that they required to the access that were required to do that migration within a bank wasn't really palatable to the management. So that although Fast Track are involved in the kind of movement to the cloud and providing some expertise and that kind of thing, we didn't take them up on the option to do the migration. I don't know if anyone's kind of been involved in the Fast Track migration at all. Yeah. Okay. And then you've got the the third-party migration tools and setting up a migration factory and building out a whole process of which you can integrate with specialist tools to do reporting and have a migration factory for all your different workloads, which is kind of the approach that we're taking, where we're shifting one workload at a time, and there's quite complicated sort of reporting tools to analyze parts of the organization to move next, do the licensing, is kind of adding scripts into there to license people, to set up their OneDrive, to deploy the GPOs and everything else, and the current POC we're using to do the migration is the ShareGate, but other options we're probably looking at is Azure Data Box to actually for some of the larger file share stuff that might go into SharePoint rather than OneDrive, actually driving that to the data center and migrating it that way. But they're the kind of some of the third-party tool options that are on the market, I guess, that probably many people know about. And then if we talk about operating OneDrive, and I think this is where Microsoft are really been lacking, certainly from the end user support. So what we're looking at here is sync admin reports, and this hasn't arrived yet, but this is something that's been announced and is coming, and I think is kind of really really needed, because in a large organization there isn't really a good way of knowing. Users don't really know when their OneDrive stop work syncing, and I know there are big red errors, but they don't always know. They don't always take any notice of those, and then something happens to their machine, and actually you find out that they haven't, then when OneDrive hasn't been syncing for a month or 2 months or something, and there's a whole world of pain for for IT. So what this allows you to see is, it's a view of the OneDrive sync health across the organization. So, who's got errors, how many errors, what they are. You can see, there's a kind of roll up of that, and it allows kind of the operations team to, to identify issues rather than having to use other tools and kind of build, cobble together solutions to, check event logs and work out, and pull the data into one place and then provide that themselves. Microsoft have finally realized that this is a bit of a problem. So this is coming along, this OneDrive Sync Health, and that will be very welcome. Next thing to talk about well, we've already touched on actually is the admin. There is a new or the SharePoint Admin Center is getting some more control, or some the OneDrive settings are going to get rolled in there. So some of those settings you can see now are actually coming into the SharePoint Admin Center, and that'll be happening fairly shortly, I think, as well. And then one of the other things that we found that we've started looking at, and it is, given it's a kind of global company, and there's 100,000 users scattered across most of the globe, is the ability to provide information about your internal network. So and you can essentially build out a network map, and you can see the network connection quality for all the Microsoft 365 data in your network, essentially. So using the OneDrive client, it kind of it kind of absorbs where all the different it kind of look at the various subnets that your users are on, and then you can provide the geographical information of actually where are those subnets physically located, and then Microsoft will monitor and provide guidance. Maybe there is a nearer a nearer connection basically to an Exchange front door or something that makes more sense, rather than going across an internal WAN and coming out in another country and trying to get into the the Microsoft backbone, essentially. So this is kind of about network optimization, and as I said before, ideally you want your users as close to your internet egress point as you can possibly can. And that's it. Has anyone got any questions?
I've got a bit more of a question. So the one thing that I've wanted to do, and you alluded to it right at the beginning, is deploy a standard set of folders as part of this process. So I have a model that I encourage all of my clients and people to use, and I haven't got an easy way of doing that. So you mentioned scripts. Can you expand on how you would deploy a standard set of folders, and also how they may or may not interact with the rest of the migration process?
Yes, so you can, essentially it's very easy to do with a bit of PowerShell to, sync, have in the same way as those, getting those GUIDs for the document library. So if I just go to a SharePoint site quickly. Say quickly.
Yeah.
Very slow. On the site. Okay. So I just go in once it eventually loads. I just go into this document library here. And if I click on the sync button, and then I don't actually have to sync here, I can just cancel this.
Yeah.
But then I've got this copy library ID
Yeah.
here. So I just copy that. I just copy that library ID, and that's just that GUI that I talked about.
Mhm.
Now you can either, you can either do that via group policy or what have you. But there is some, I can't remember the exact PowerShell. But I can forward it you afterwards.
That'd be good, actually, Paul.
Simon, and essentially, if you find a way to run that for those users, then you can do that. I mean, if they're got machines that are in Intune joined again, you could deploy it that way, or if it depends on, there's probably lots of ways that a login script. If they have a login script, you could include it in a login script, or you could just get them to run it once just to configure it on their local machine. I mean, it kind of depends on how many users it is and what kind of setup they've got, I guess. But essentially, you can do it with a couple of lines of PowerShell for each document library you want to sync. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Dan, did you have another question? Your hand is up.
No, I didn't. That was just from last time.
No worries. Just checking. It's amazing, isn't it? When you start to kind of delve into this, you realize how much complexity and how many settings and things there are to tweak this
yeah,
stuff.
and do you know what? There's so much other stuff that that's probably left out that we've not really talked about as well. It is quite a quite a complex thing, especially when you've got lots of different flavors of desktops and persistent VDIs and non-persistent VDIs and laptop users, and some users are coming in across a VPN, and some use to do split tunneling to go out, etc. It can get quite complicated, right?
Yeah.
I guess anything's complicated at scale, isn't it? Even something that sounds simple.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And managing it and
Right. Well, thank you very much, Paul. If there's no other questions, that was really an interesting session to go through. There's a heck of a lot to go through, yeah. I hope I never do a OneDrive deployment like that.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of wonder. Talking about this, but I mean, I guess a lot of organisations have already, gone to the cloud. I can never quite get the feeling of, is there still, people now that are, there's still large numbers of organisations that are not jumped on the cloud bandwagon yet, or, I never can quite tell, I suppose, from what my feeling is.
There's loads.
Yeah.
There's a lot. We've got them coming out of recent moment. Just people who want to go on the cloud.
Yeah, I suppose recently, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. If there's one thing the last year's taught you, is that there are advantages to being in the cloud.
Yeah.
True. Well, they've given a few people the push run. They kick up the backside, I suppose.
So there's one thing I discovered trying to solve a problem for someone this week on OneDrive. So they had a problem where they tried to do a live training session. It all went to pot, but they had the good sense to record the video. But of course, it's an external client that they had, so you can't share the recording out of Stream because that doesn't have external access right now. So they wanted to be able to share it to the client, but they wanted to be able to block download because it's got proprietary information in it.
Right.
And I said, oh no, it's easy. You just turn on the block download option. And then I discovered that block download only exists for a subset of all the files that you can put in OneDrive. Video files currently cannot be blocked for download. So there's a big watch out that I genuinely didn't know until yesterday afternoon.
Aren't the videos going into OneDrive actually at some point soon?
Yeah,
Yeah,
at some point.
yeah, because Stream's being rolled into SharePoint
It is.
storage, isn't it? And that will mean you can actually manage the files properly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know when that's happening, but
It's imminent. So, because of the conversations I was tracking around my challenge yesterday, they actually started rolling it out, and then they hit a technical problem, as Microsoft are inclined to do sometimes. So they've rolled the rollout back, but it's coming. In the meantime, if anyone needs to do it, the only workaround I could find was to embed the video in a PowerPoint slide, and then you can block the PowerPoint slide down. I know it's just so inelegant, but sometimes needs must.
I believe it's working. If it's a line of PowerShell you can run on your tenant to enable it in the background. It's not available in the front end or the admin centers yet, but we've got it in ours. It just creates a folder in either your OneDrive or the Teams library for recordings and drops them all in there in MP4, which seems to work pretty well. It sets all the permissions for the meeting attendees and everything.
I've just dropped the docs article about changing over to OneDrive and SharePoint recording from Teams meetings into the chat. It's working very well. I've got it running in 3 or 4 different tenants. The only thing we're missing that you've got in Stream is the transcript.
Right.
Okay.
But you can upload the video into Stream to get the transcript.
Or indeed upload it, if you just pull the audio out, upload it into Word Online, because that does transcripts.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So if anyone's interested, I can share my default folder structure, the one that I recommend for people.
Go for it.
Be more interested in the reasoning behind why you do it.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, well, I can do that too.
You weren't talking about document libraries in SharePoint, then you were talking about actually having folders inside your OneDrive.
Yes.
Well, ignore everything I told you then.
Yeah, well, I did wonder. That's why I didn't give you an enthusiastic, rapturous response. I went, okay.
No, so what we have done that, but essentially it's a provisioning script, in front of the OneDrive creation, and then essentially using, creating the document libraries that way.
Right.
Out of interest, Paul, how many person days of effort do you think went into this migration for this hypothetical large organization that you have been doing this with?
Oh my God. More than, I don't know, it's not even complete yet, so I wouldn't like to guess, but it will be ridiculous. I mean,
multiples of 100, not multiples of 10.
Yes. Maybe into 1,000. Yeah, it's. I mean, there's a lot of additional complication, regulatory, different areas have different regulations. Some countries can be on borders, so like Switzerland, Turkey, Luxembourg can't be on borders. So then your joiners process has to reflect that. Whereabouts in the world are they? There's further complication around have they signed particular legal documents, and that has to be, there's be a whitelist around that. It's really complicated, and as well as e-discovery requirements. Some people are under surveillance, some are under retention. Some, it's really, really, really complicated. So even the things we talked about here is just the tip of the iceberg, really. In sort of heavily regulated organisations.
Okay, I've managed to remember how to do sharing. I've taken a screenshot of this and stuck it in the chat so people can grab it as well. But I've been using this for 3 or 4 years now, successfully, and all of my OneDrives always have these folders, not that many others. There's a few that the system generates, and these are the ones that I generate, and I discourage people from having too many other top level folders because it creates clutter. And it goes a bit like this: everyone needs a temp folder. So on our in my companies, no one's allowed to store anything locally, but they're allowed to store anything in OneDrive or SharePoint and sync it locally. And so temp is I just need somewhere to put something right now folder. And the rule is that you should be able to empty that temp folder at any moment, completely delete it, and lose nothing of value. So that's the way temp folders work. It's not an indefinite archive, it's a temp folder. Then we have this idea of a private folder, and the private folder serves one purpose, because everything's in OneDrive is nominally private, right up until the moment you leave the company, and the rights to it defer over to your manager or whoever you've got set up in one of the policies that Paul alluded to. The private folder is intended to say, if someone is to go through your OneDrive after you've left, they mustn't look in here. And actually the first job of the admin is to delete that folder, because there could be sensitive stuff that would put them and the employee in trouble. Then after that, you've got these three other things. Shared with everyone is a folder I use for just dropping stuff in there that anybody in the company can have. So it's a good place to put thoughts and articles or pictures of OneDrive structures I just want people to get, usually because there isn't somewhere better in SharePoint or anywhere else to put it at that moment in time. So that's anyone can have it. I often have an image folder in there if I've got some images that I want people to have access to. Shared with team is a top level folder. The only thing in that usually is a set of then subfolders, and this is for sharing stuff directly with my teams. And I don't usually use it anymore because I've got Microsoft Teams. So this has been made almost entirely redundant by the presence of MS Teams. Then the final one of importance is shared externally. So if, again, I'm not using Microsoft Teams with an external partner, client or whatever, but I do need to share stuff with them, I will create a subfolder for that named client and put things in that which I share. There is an additional folder in there called public that I put stuff in that anybody can have access to, and I'm not afraid to provide a public access link to. And the point about that is it provides a layer of governance. I know that if I'm putting something in a shared externally area, chances are it could be shared externally, because that's what it's for. So I think about what I put in there rather than inadvertently sharing something from somewhere else that probably should have been kept quite private or proprietary to the company. So that's my structure and my rationale.
Yeah, we do create a private and personal folder, and that purpose of that is, like you say, HR information, etc. And one of the reasons for doing that is if someone moves from one legal, the bank is made up of various kind of legal, companies, legal entities around, there's 180 of them or something, and if they move from one legal entity to another, they can't take any of the rest of the data with them. So that has to be hived off somewhere and archived for that, because it's owned by one legal entity, and whoever they go to, which legal entity they go and work for after that, they can't take that data with them. But obviously OneDrive doesn't give you a good way of recreating their user without recreating their accounts and all that kind of stuff. So there's a whole process built around getting rid of everything else in their OneDrive, properly deleting it, apart from if it's under retention, for example, in which case it will get, we're there for e-discovery purposes further down the line. But yeah, that's quite. But none of the other kind of things, I guess, after that, people are welcome to do with what they want, apart from external sharing is something we're looking to introduce now with the appropriate controls, but it's not currently available.
On creating the folders, I've just looked at Graph API, and there is a create folder post, and then you can look up the IDs of the users to create folders. I don't know if it works, so I'm just reading it on the website, but there is definitely a Graph API for OneDrive folders.
So Paul, does your technique primarily work when you're first deploying OneDrive, or can it be applied retrospectively as Adam's?
No, it could be deployed retrospectively, or we could use Graph, or we could use I think we're using PMP, or CSOM or PMP. I can't remember what it is, whichever way we're doing it now. But yeah, essentially, it could work in the same way. You could use the same thing, I guess. But you've got this one use case for this private and personal information, really, and not to add additional folders further down the line currently. So then there are other things that we currently do to a user's OneDrive to at the moment we can't use Flow and Power Apps, so we hide away the buttons. And there's a few other things we have to do from a kind of configuration point of view that you probably wouldn't do in a normal company. So it's just part of that process essentially. So as well as the kind of pre-provisioning, if you're going to give going to do 1,000, migrate 1,000 people at a time, you need to pre-provision them ideally, and rather than wait for them to go to their OneDrive, particularly as we're doing this configuration anyway. So but yeah, you could do it. It could be done. That script could be done at any point. Essentially, you could create other folders.
Cool.
I guess it's customary at this point for us to all go and get a drink and come back to mull it over a glass of something liquid, isn't it?
It is, and I'm up for it tonight.
Yep, I'm going to grab a beer.
Right. So, yep. 5 minutes. Grab yourself a drink of your preference, and we'll have a chat.
Okay.
Yep.
See you. How's the family then, Paul?
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah.
How old's your little girl now?
She's nearly 6 in a
Good God, that's just wrong,
weeks.
isn't
Yeah,
it?
2 weeks. I think today. I think it is. She's 6. Yeah.
Bloody hell!
It's
God, it only seems like a year ago that you were looking forward to her being born and everything.
I know. Yeah. Yeah. It's flown by, hasn't it? It's crazy, really.
Terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
How's your daughter? What's she
Oh
up to?
God, I think she's just a star. So she's down in Sheffield right now. So she started her PhD back in in September.
Mm.
So she's cracking on with that. She's been quarantined for the last 12 days or something because her housemate was thought to have COVID. She had a positive test because she's a dental student, so gets tested every week.
Right.
But of course, the rate of false positives is something like 13%. So when you get tested every week, you're bound to get tested as positive. So then Ella had to lock down, but yeah, but she's been tested and they're all clear. It's fine.
Okay.
Which is good because she's going to start work on Thursday testing COVID lab samples.
Oh, is she?
Yeah,
All
she's
right.
got a bit of for a couple of weeks, she's got a job on good money by all accounts, doing some testing because she's a fully qualified, experienced lab tech.
Is this
Cool.
your daughter?
Mm.
Someone? I chatted to a guy at Public Health England actually, who's involved in sorting out all the testing. You talk about the lateral flow tests that they're great at detecting negative COVID, but if they detect a positive, then it's likely that it's a false positive, and you need to be retested with the traditional test. So.
Ella was saying that apparently, if you test them within so many minutes or so many hours of the test being done, then they tend to show errors on one side. So they're more likely to show a false positive, for example. And if you test it after a certain period of time, they're more likely to show a false negative. And so you've got this time window of about 30 minutes in which you really should test them in order